Hello, 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 hello. I'm going to real quick thread a different sewing machine in white. And then we're going to start with looking at where the little fairy doll bodice is right now. We're going to look at the fairy doll sleeve, making that cute little ruffled sleeve. And then we're going to start putting some layers onto our panty for the white and purple one, and just see where we get to today. I think we'll probably go for like an hour and a half. And then I sent everybody another link for tomorrow. And we're trucking along. We're in pretty good spots with everything. And then at the end of today, I'll show you the fairy doll top plate and where that's at and what Deborah's been doing with that. It's looking super duper cute. So real quick, I'm going to thread a machine in white. Maybe I've got a white bodice. And the dog's going to be quiet. No, I'm good. I got an industrial one. But you know what? Would you look where the elastic is, Deborah, and see if you can find any white 1/4-inch elastic? And grab me that. Look, I forgot how to thread the machine.
Where is the elastic?
Just over here to the left of the thread. If you can't find any, that's fine. I'll come look. But I want 1/4-inch white. But don't worry, if you can't find it, I'll run over and look real quick. It might have a white disc on each side of it, and it might just be on a big long tube or on one of those rolls. That's perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. I'm ready. Here we go. Let's see. So, what we're gonna do first is look at this little fairy doll sleeve and kind of put it together first. One of those, and then we'll go on from there. Okay. So that's not the fairy doll sleeve. Let's revisit fairy doll sleeve. So if you remember the other day, we made this pattern that's got a little puff at the shoulder, and we are going to have a casing that's like a little ways down from the bicep, and then we're going to also put a casing in the bottom. And if you remember, the lace that we were working with had a pretty scalloped edge, but the scalloped edge didn't really tie in with my sleeve. So I want to show you what I have done so far, and we'll see if I lose all the pieces. So the first thing I did was, out of my lace, I cut and I added a 1/2 inch of seam allowance. I cut my original kind of white with pink lace. Then I cut the scalloped edge off of both edges of the lace. So I cut the whole scalloped edge off, and I think I have got it over here flat. Will help to look at it. So I cut my sleeve out first in fashion, and I added a 1/2 inch. Then I cut my scalloped edge off of both sides. So I just picked a point in the embroidery and chopped off the scalloped edge. And then I ran 2 rows of gathering stitch into the flat part of my scallop so that I could first evenly gather it to the bottom of my sleeve. So that's where we're at right now. So I've got my pretty scalloped edge gathered onto the bottom of my sleeve, right sides together. Then I cut a second sleeve in just cheapo sheer white lining, and I've got my scallopy, pretty embroidered edge sandwiched between the two. So I've got my lining up against my fashion, and you'll see that I marked on my lining. It doesn't show so great. I put some dots where that casing is going to go below the bicep, so we can stitch a channel in there. Now, sometimes you'll have a sleeve where the lining is shorter than the fashion to make the sleeve poof, but we want this one to kind of have a droopy kind of feeling to it. So I'm not putting a layer of net in here, or I'm not putting a ruffle on the lining to make it puffy. We're just using the lining to make the casing and using the lining to give it just a little bit of body. So the first thing we're going to do over at the sewing machine is stitch this ruffle in there, 1/2 inch from the edge. Then we can serge it also. Then we're going to flip it over and put the casings in and stuff and look a little more at this sleeve. So let's go over to this sewing machine. Hopefully the dog stays quiet today. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is stitch in 1/2 inch from the edge. Need some scissors. So you could say that I've got the right side of my ruffle facing the right side of my fashion sleeve, and that I've also got the right side. If my lining had a right or wrong side, I would put the right side of the lining also facing down to the fashion. Would you hand me the pin thing that's right there? Thanks. So we're trapping the ruffle in here. And there's loads and loads and loads of ways to do this stuff. This is just one of them. So now I'm going to be putting a casing right near this edge that we're going to run an elastic in. So I don't want all this thickness in there. So I'm going to just turn around and I'm going to serge off about 1/2 of that seam allowance of everything. And really, you could open this up and preview to see if you've done or caught your ruffle in some weird way. And I haven't. So I'm gonna move forward and cut part of this off. If you were super duper confident, you could just start by serging this. But I like to have a moment in case I've screwed something up where I can fix it. Usually serging is kind of has a finality to it. And I think one of my seam allowances didn't get caught. It didn't. My lining seam allowance moved out of the way, so I'm going to just catch him. Just a little spot. So now, whoops, sorry. I'm going to flip this all over. And actually, this is one of those spots where if you're an understitcher, go ahead and understitch. That means I'm going to push all my seam allowances, even what we just serged, towards the lining, and I'm going to stitch it down. So I've got all my fashiony pretty stuff on the left, and I'm going to stitch my seam allowance towards the lining. And that's called an understitch. And you don't need a press at this point because you're using your hands to make sure everything is laying in the right direction. Once we put a little elastic in here, everybody will be like, oh yeah, I get where this is going. Okay, so now we're gonna flip it all out. So right now we've got our sleeve begun with our ruffle on the bottom, but we're going to be putting a gather in the bottom, and we're going to be putting a gather part way up to make a little more interesting sleeve. If it had 3 bumps to it, you could call it a bishop sleeve, but it doesn't have 3 bumps, so it's just, I don't know what you'd call it. Okay, so now I'm going to go up from my seam allowance that's holding my ruffle in, And I'm going to use 1/4 inch elastic in my casing. So that means I need to make a casing that's a little bit bigger than 1/4 inch. So I'm going to make about a 3/8 inch casing to feed the elastic through. Because remember, we've got that seam allowance we just serged in there. Ooh, and hopefully a safety pin fits through here. Really, that's the size I should be going for. If a safety pin doesn't fit, I can grab like a yarn needle. And if you cut your sleeve just straight across the bottom, you could just use the scalloped edge in your fabric just like it is without having to like sneak it back on there. But nowhere in history has someone said that fairy doll's sleeve ruffle is too ruffly. So we're just going to go for it. Okay, so the next thing, we've got this other casing partway up that I've marked. So I just want to line up my shoulders and my armpits and just get a couple pins because we don't want stuff to shift around while we're working. And then I'm going to stitch on either side of that line that we've made there. If you wanted to just beef up the cap a little bit, you could fold this down and put in just like a little crescent of diamond netting so that that would get ruffled in, and that would help keep the cap of the sleeve really poofy. But we're going for kind of relaxed fluff here. We don't want it to be completely frou-frou. We want like a level 6 frou-frou, not a level 10 frou-frou. So now I'm going to put a few pins where my casing is. So I just made little dots along where my casing is. And I've got to connect them as I sew. Okay. Oh, I lost my bobbin. Then the other thing to think about is like, if you want to be able to really get to the elastic and adjust it, you could also figure out where to put little buttonholes on the lining so that you can just feed the elastic right over the seam allowance through some little buttonholes, like interface and make a little buttonhole in the lining in your channel. But I am going to adjust this on her in a fitting before I serge together the underside of the sleeve. So eventually the underarm of this can get serged together. The other thing you can do is just sew the seam together and put a little clip in the lining. Maybe that's what we'll do instead. So now my channel also kind of curves with the shape of the sleeve. So we're going to follow that curve. And I want to be a little bit bigger than the elastic so that the elastic has a little room to slide around in there. And we'll shove some elastic here in a second so you can see how this is going. Now, let's go ahead and put the gathering stitch in the top. So I've got 2 notches for my back arm. So that's actually called your balance point. So I'm just putting a double pin there so I don't accidentally close that up. Actually, we could serge the top edge of this together now. Let's do that. We're going to serge the top edge of this sleeve so it's finished, and then we're going to put a gathering stitch between the balance points over the shoulder. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Oh boy, my phone is hopping today. And you could serge the underarms now and just put a little clip for the elastic. But I think what we're going to do is put the elastic in. And since this young lady is local, we will fit it. And then I'll finish it off. And this is one of those tutus that's going to get worn 3 times and then left in a closet for some woman's children to figure out what to do with when she's left the earth. So, and then I like to know where my shoulder is, so I'm going to keep a pin at my shoulder. And now you want a really wide stitch, like a basting stitch. A really long stitch, not a wide stitch. So I'm going to go from balance point to balance point is generally where you gather a sleeve. I like to just pull the top thread and make a U and then change directions instead of taking it out of the machine, cutting the thread, and then changing direction. So I sewed it a 1/2 inch and now I'm sewing kind of between a 1/2 inch and the edge. With this machine that sounds like a shotgun all of a sudden. Let's gather the top a little bit and then we will put our other 2 elastics in real fast. Got a knot. And you want to pull both gathering stitches nice and even. Some machines the bobbin stitch pulls easier and some the top thread pulls easier. You just got to kind of try both and then figure out what it is that works better for you. So I don't need it super gathered, but then I'm going to grab my little loop that I made on that side. So we've got the beginning of our sleeve. So we've got our cap started. Now, if I have a safety pin, I had one the other day, I will put some of the elastics in so we can see how that's going to go. So I know her biceps only about 9 or 10 inches. So I'm going to just start with 11. And I bet around her elbows probably 11 or 12. So I'll just do 11 and 12. And this is just 1/4 inch plain elastic. It's not the woven one, it's the braided one. The braided one tends to last longer. Okay, so now my casing's just wide enough to fit a safety pin. Another good tool is a bodkin or a roach clip if you are into smoking joints. It's the same tool. Sometimes it's the same tool, it depends. But it's always funny when people come into the costume shop and go, "Why do you have a roach clip?" And you're like, "Oh, that's not what that is for me." Okay, so there's one of our poofs. And actually I can pull it out a little bit more so that we've got a little negative ease so that it'll fit tight around her arm instead of just laying on her arm. We don't want this to shift. So now we've got our shoulder puff going on and then our like below the bicep puff going on, and now we'll put our last elastic in the bottom. And if you've got a dress form arm, usually you can just fit this stuff right to the dress form arm and it will fit most young dancers and adult dancers. Now I've got the seam allowance, so it's a little bit tighter here. You want to hand me that and I'll just hang it up? I want to see who it is.
It's your mom.
It's my mom. Let's tell her. I'm teaching a class. How are you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't want to interrupt.
No, just say hi, everybody.
Well, hello, everybody. This is Travis's mommy.
It's Travis's mom. It's not an emergency?
Huh?
Is it an emergency? I'm just threading elastic.
Not at all.
Okay, I love you and miss you. I will call you tonight. Okay, love you. Bye. Bye. Oh, Dad's there too. I bet their Kansas City steak order came. That's what I do for Christmas when I don't know what to get people. I send them bundles of meat. But nobody's ever said, oh, well, maybe a vegetarian would. Where I'm from, people like bundles of meat. Some steak, some chicken, some lobster, mac and cheese, a little bit of everything. There. This is going to be very sweet when it's all done. And what's fun with the scallop getting chopped off of the original sleeve fabric is right now you can't tell that it's been like re-stuck on there. It looks like it's just one piece of fabric. So there is the beginning of our cute little sleeve. And in that spot where we dropped the back, let me just see if I can find the front. So it's the very back of this now has that longer section. So when it's on her arm, the back of her elbow is going to have more poof at the back of her elbow than the front. So you can kind of start to see that here's the front of her arm where we scooped the bottom of the sleeve up. It's going to be a little bit flatter, but at the back of her arm, it's going to be a little bit poofier, which is just a little more attractive on a human body. And it's worked through like all of costume history to do that. So I just kind of stick with that stuff. So does anybody have any question about how we got this much of the sleeve together? What's left is to just zip together the underarm. And actually we could put the underarm together and just skip over the casings. And then it's like put together to fit it, but we can still pull our elastics. And then after we fit it, we can finish it off. Let me see if I've got the arm over here. I don't think I do. That's all right. Let me know if anybody has any question on how we got to that from this. So there's our original sleeve. And we've got all of that. And it's great to use your lining to make your casing, kind of like we did on the leg of the panty, rather than lining the sleeve and then stitching an extra casing on, which makes it thick and a little more challenging to do. So that's the beginning. I wish I had a ballerina's arm. But you can see, this is going to go up by our elbow, that's going to be a really cute little itty bitty thing when it's done. So let's actually see, Jared has been putting more of her bodice together. So it's starting to happen. Here's the fronts of our fairy doll. So you remember we were putting those decorative bands or folds on the other day. We've got the fronts going on. What's left is our center front, which we are going to flatline also with the leftover piece of, we're going to flatline the front with what is left over from making our sleeves. So we've got this piece of pink and white embroidered lace, and I will applicate, or not applicate, but I will stitch on the crisscross onto the center front before all the rest of this goes together. And this center front edge is going to get piped all the way up to the shoulder. So we'll put the piping on these two edges first before we stick in the center front, and then we'll pipe the bottom separate and the back separate so that we can adjust it at the side seam. But this is actually, this is this arm. So you can start to see that this little girl's top is taking shape. Yeah, let's put some netting onto the skirt. And I think I'm going to just sit down and sew We've got 6 or 7 layers. I think I'm going to just put it all on and then start tacking. And then we'll see. I plan to go to about 4:30 today. So if you've got to go at 4, just go. But you will still get all the recordings. So let me grab my panty. And let's also kind of look for a second at where that bodice is at. So we've got our 2 halves of bodice. Remember, we put one chunk of it together the other day. We now have both sides of the bodice. We've got the center front yet to sew up. And then I will start cutting out and placing the appliques on here. And let me show you where the top plate for this is actually before we start putting netting on the tutu. So to place this stuff on, I have to remember, right, that it's got a hip in it and that it's got a boob in it. So I will take and put this partially on the dress form, like each section of this. I'll work with it on the dress form so that I'm putting the pieces on with the correct shape. Like you don't want to just lay this on the table and pin it on. You want to work kind of in 3 dimensions. You want to not work flat with this stuff. Then I'll figure out where can I go around by hand and start tacking it on. And then once the perimeter's tacked on, sometimes I'll go to the inside and just do a couple cross stitches across the section so that I've got little pricks holding the applique in place rather than just going around the outside. You could also come through and hand sew the inside together as well. And I'll use a back stitch probably so that my needle will always be entering the fabric one way, but I'll be traveling the other way. And that keeps it a little more knotted, that if it comes undone, it'll tie itself off. The other thing you can do, you'd have to be mindful of the seam allowance and stuff. You can get this pinned on and you can use a free motion foot and put large sections of it on all the way through. But just know that you want to keep stuff pinned. You want to put a few pins through all your layers so that nothing is shifting, which is sometimes why I find it's faster on the bodice to put it on by hand than it is to pray and wrestle and wish that I had it all lined up in the machine. Okay, so let's look at the top plate so far. And we've got our netting that we dyed the other day gathered too. So this is looking really sharp. So let me just kind of show you what we've got so far. So we've got our piece of netting that we dyed some triangles in, and I said that it would come out kind of ombre looking. You can kind of start to see what I mean, that even though they're triangles, it's darker at the waist, and then where the points of the triangles are, your brain kind of like just makes it seem like it's ombre. So we've got that piece of net. And then I said that, remember, we made the tulle like super, super, super duper long. So I really ruffled that nice and tight to try to get it closer to our 30-inch high hip. So a little bit will still get eased onto the panty. And then we have got the beginnings, actually way more than the beginnings, of our fabulous top plate. So this is onto the purple donut. Remember, we started with the purple donut the other day, and then there's pieces hanging off. The pieces that are hanging off are eventually going to get hooked to a piece of white net. And then the other thing that I'll do is in a few spots, I'll come and I'll trim away a little bit of this backing in a couple places so that we can see all the way through to the net. So not everywhere, but in a few spots, we'll trim away just a little bit of the backing that's on the lace itself so that we can see some of that purple. And then the other trick, I'll use the airbrush, just like we airbrushed on the bodice the other day. I will kind of carefully airbrush a few spots around some of these flowers to make the backing mesh purple instead of cream, so that we can keep the illusion of we want it to be really dark purple around her waist. And the way the appliques are so far, we kind of have this 5-pointed star going on, but then we'll start to cut out a few of these little guys, some of the smaller appliques, and start just putting them in a few spots, kind of coming away from the main thing to just kind of make it a little more broken up. But we still want to keep it purple at the waist, going out to white at the edges. So let's move this out of the way. And let's start putting some net on. Just like we did the panty the whole way the other day from a couple of people's requests. The last time we did this, I just put some netting on. I've had a few people message and say they want it all. So we're going to do all the net. But I'm going to have a sip of water first. Knock on wood, the dog's behaving. Right, cue the dog. Okay, so I've got stuff ruffled double. So I have 1 and 2 together. I have 3 and 4 together. Let's actually look at 5 and 6. So 5 and 6 is the one that's going to get our hoop casing in it, right? So what I did first on 5 and 6 is I stitched together the edge that's getting ruffled or that goes to the hip. Then I came out and stitched my hoop casing in. So 5 and 6, the hoop is just going to get shoved right in between there like that. So 5 and 6 is making the casing for the hoop rather than sewing on a separate piece. And if you're home ruffling foot or however you're ruffling, you can't combine layers, but you would like to, you can gather or ruffle a single layer, gather or ruffle a single layer, then zigzag the 2 edges together at the hip, which is a little more work, but it's still less sewing on the panty. So let's grab the panty, and we're going to be at this machine for a little while. Oh my gosh, I'm so... Oh, Mom says, what I called to tell you for. Oh, it's funny. It's something I can't tell you guys, but it's pretty funny. Some of you I'll tell later. I can tell you a little bit. Has anybody ever seen my rants about how crooked people often will use religious pages to advance their crooked pages? That's all been confirmed and coming down the wire from some major companies. So watch out. If you share daily prayer, you might actually be advertising for Pornhub.com. The more you know. It's true. Have you ever seen that or seen my explanation? What a lot of people don't realize is that anybody can have a Facebook page and title it anything they want. So a lot of crooked sites, politicians, entertainment industry, alcohol industry, they will get very nice sounding Facebook pages. And then by people liking those nice sounding Facebook pages, it boosts their traffic on their not so great web page. I just think that stuff's interesting. And it's hard to explain to some people. Okay, so, right, we're going to work from the bottom up. So we're going to work from the short layers to the long layers, which some people accuse me of saying that's the French way to do it. And I've never thought that that's a bad thing, and it's how I learned how to do it. So if you like to go long to short, keep going long to short if it works for you. For me, it works to go from short to long. So I've got my crotch of the panty on the right of my equation here. But what I have found over the last couple years is I like to not put on the first row first. I like to put on the second row first, because the first row has a tendency to twist around while you're sewing it. So we've doubled our rows. So we've got 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. The first thing I'm going to put on is 3 and 4. And remember, we gathered up 5 widths of 54, but I said we don't quite need 5 widths of 54 for 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. So I'm going to just lay it on flat and cut off the extra. So I'm not squishing on all of 3 and 4. But what we're going to do is 3 and 4 are going to run up with the ruffle up towards the body, and 1 and 2 are going to run with the ruffle up towards the body. Then 5 and 6 are going to run down 7, 8 are going to run up, and then everything else is going to run down. That's also some folks refer to as doing it French. But what it is you can control the silhouette of the tutu by having stuff run up and run down. If you run all the layers pointing down towards the ground, it will be more work to keep it up and flat. So if you have some layers running up and some layers running down, they will like fight against each other and start to make a flatter tutu. So if you want a bell, start with everything running down. There's no reason to run any layers up, except maybe the shortest one, run it up, just because it looks nice underneath. So I'm just laying this on flat and going. And when you double your layers too, you got to make sure that when they lay back down that you actually have the short one will end up underneath. You don't want the long one to end up underneath. And I don't start pinning and dividing until I get to the longer layers where we're going to scrunch them all on. So starting with 5 and 6, we're going to put all 5 widths across the panty. And the nice thing about doing this on an industrial machine, besides the nice big wide zigzag, I'm able to lift the foot up with my knee so that I can control stuff as I'm going. And you've got a really nice flatbed surface to work on here. So after this one pass of sewing, we're already going to have 2 layers on. And I'm just kind of moving it to my marks. And then you don't want it to go all the way into the seam allowance. So I cut it like 1/4 inch past the seam allowance. And then I just lay over the tiniest bit. You don't want to lay over a whole bunch because then you'll end up with this really thick butt. But you can lay over an itty bitty bit. So when I first started making them, and the first few that I learned on, we didn't double any layers, but we would do layer 1 up, layer 2 down, 3 up, 4 down, 5 up, 6 down, 7 up, and then usually 8, 9, 10, or 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, all going down. Like 7 or 8 are usually the last ones that you put going up. But if you've got something that's already working, don't change it. So now I've got my 1 and 2. And our ruffle machine works on a chain stitch, so you can't leave it without material in it, which is why you see me cutting off pieces of crepe paper every now and then. We have to feed crepe paper through it. So I'm going to turn over just a teeny itty little bit. I'm not going into my seam allowance because the center back's going to get sewn up later. And now I'm following my bottom set of lines. And the only reason I put the one on above this first is when I start with this shorter layer, it wants to just twist and twist and twist. So I find by putting the layer on just above it and then going to the short one, it's not as able to twist as easily. So now I'm skirting my leg casing, and I want to make sure that I'm not catching the elastic or shrinking up my leg casing. And a big part of this too is just being conscious of what's going on underneath. Like, do you have a weird fold or something? And if you got a weird fold, fix it before you stitch it down. Like having the seam rip stuff on the panty is the worst. This mesh stuff is very hard to seam rip. Okay, we've almost, there's a piece of hair. Oh no, it was thread. I thought, who's got big, thick, long black hair? So we've almost got 4 layers on this sucker in not that much time. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Again, I'm gonna just cut just a smidge past the seam allowance and turn over the itziest little bit because I don't want it to be fuller at the center back. I just want it to look nice. And then I like to backstitch right at the edge of the ruffle and then backstitch at the end of the seam allowance, just so nothing ever comes undone there. Hey, look at that, we're nearly halfway. So now let's go ahead and put on 5 and 6, which is right there on the end of the table. So this is the first time I'm going to pin some stuff. So I've got 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 going up. Now I'm going to put 5 and 6 going down. And I've got a pencil line at the center front of my panty. So the first thing I'm going to do is fold 5 and 6 in half. So now we want to keep with all of the volume or all of the length going onto here. And I want to make sure that 5 is really underneath 6. So I'm going to pin my center front. And then I think I did the drawing for you guys where we talked about like a marching band going around a corner, which is we want more at the hip. So what I'm going to do, so now I'm at my center back. I'm going to fold over like 1/4 of an inch. I'm going to pin like 3 inches flat at my center back. So I've got my center back pinned. I'm going to go over about 3 inches. Actually, it's right about to my next notch. And I'm going to pin that much flat. Then from my center front, I'm going to go about 3 inches on either side of the center front and pin that. So what we're trying to do is make the netting around the tutu look more even rather than having the gathers up against her body all look even. So now we've got this lump of extra material at the side. So I'm going to just divide it in half and kind of pin the center of it. So as I'm sewing, I know how much I've got to kind of mush or ease in onto each side. We worked with a girl from Romania named Lavinia, and she titled this the Romanian Smash. Do you remember that, Deborah? She'd say, you've got to do the Romanian smash, but you have to do it just right. It's controlled smashing. So I've got my center back. Now I'm going to go about 3 inches over again from my center back, 3-ish. And then I've got the 3 inches on either side of my front. So it's kind of like, it also is kind of like, you know how like a lot of skirts, you'll make the front flat and then the gathers go from the front all the way around the back, like a lot of Victorian skirts are like that. It's kind of like that. Okay, so now we're going to sew on 5 and 6, which they're running down. So we went up, up, down. But you could go up, down, up, down. That's something to play with. So now what's going to want to happen is my panty wants to scrunch up no matter what. So I've got to really pay attention to that, like other layers aren't getting folded weird and caught under my foot, and that my panty isn't doing something weird. So I've got my first flat bit on. So now I'm going to like rearrange the panty, make sure it's flat. And now I've got my first bit of material to ease on. So I'm going to just use my fingers as I'm going to even out. So see, right, I've got this bump of material here. I don't really want to stretch out the panty. I want to just squish the netting to it. And even if it looks a little pleated or lumpy right there, by the time you steam and start tacking all of this, it's gonna even out. Okay, so that's half of our first bump. Remember, we divide it in half. So now I'm going to kind of even out my second half of the first bump. The bump is just extra material. And you could put a couple more pins in this, but I find sometimes if I've got too many pins, I pay less attention to what I'm actually sewing. Like, right, sometimes you need tons of pins and sometimes you don't need that many. This is one of those times where I think you don't need as many. So now we've got our flat front. Front is flat. Keep checking underneath. So now, right, like I got to make sure I'm on the right dot too. As I'm sewing this, I'm always kind of like counting down the dots, like 10, 9, 8, 7, 5, 6, to make sure that I'm in the right spot. Oh, but like the other thing, right, where I'm talking about like we're smashing all the extra on, I have read in comments in groups where people make comments, I usually get yelled at for mine, that some folks will, you know, cut, say, you know, they'll have their formula and they say, oh, this one's 4 widths or this one's 5 widths. Then they just ruffle it with their ruffler, and in the longer, higher up layers, they just chop off whatever doesn't lay down flat. Well, what happens is you're actually like sacrificing structure of the tutu. So if you think of it like anything that's below the hoop, you don't need to fit it all on. You fit like some of it on. But anything that's like above the hoop is helping hold the skirt up, and you want to cram it all in there. You want to make it all fit. You don't want to just cut it off and pitch it. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on. 7 and 8, we're going to run going up again. And then 9 and 10 are going to run down. What time is, oh good, we're going to get this sucker sewn together today. I'm not sure if we'll get to tacking by 4:30, but we will get a start of it. And then actually, even though some of you took our tacking video, I might just send that along with everybody also, because it doesn't hurt to have extra info. So now, can you hand me that one? I thought I had them all behind me. Jared's trapped. That one up there. And then you could actually put these other two behind me on the floor.
Okay.
And it comes with a free tracing wheel. Okay, so now I've got 7 and 8, and they are going to go up, and I'm going to smash them all on. So I'm going to find the middle of 7 and 8. Oh, yeah. You know what, actually, do you see that shelf to the right of the beads that's got the Kleenex on it? Look all the way down and see if there's a box on the bottom. We might be running low. Are there some there? Cool. Deborah's been sewing a lot of things that are crunchy, sequins and beads and stuff. Okay, so now I'm going to put 7 and 8 going up again. But I want to make sure, so even though I'm sewing them up, I want to make sure that when it lays down on the skirt, that my short one actually ends up underneath. So I'm going to make sure I've got it pinned right. And and I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to make the front of this a little bit flat, and then I'm going to ease in the rest. And I'm going to do less pins this time. I'm going to just kind of look at the amount I've got to fit in and go for it. So I'm going to kind of use what I'm going to use, like the visual I had from the last 2 rows to figure out these next 2 rows, because they're the same things happening. Get rid of my crepe paper. Make sure I don't have a weird old twist. And I am going to just start sewing. So I'm going to do 3 inches of this flat on either side of the center back, and then I'm going to smash or Romanian smash the rest in. And you want to really make sure you get it anchored in. And now you can see too kind of why we put the hook and eye between the rows. It's so that I'm not stuck dealing with that hook right now. I've got the hook kind of out of the way of where I'm sewing. So I'm making sure I can see where it is I'm going. I'm going to make a bit of it flat. Then I'm going to just kind of look at how much I've got to ease in. So I'm going to just start by taking what I'm easing in and dividing it in half. And then I can figure out kind of how much I've got to ease in this first portion of it. So we're packing in more material at the side, which means you are going to have a little more steaming at the side. Initially, your sides, you're going to say, gosh, those are a bit too puffy. But if you pack it in even the whole way around, I find that before too long, the sides are dipping. So that's why we're putting in some more cement at the sides here in a way. Check your panty. Okay, we're almost to the center front. Got the last little bit to ease in on that side. It's a sea of white. Keep checking the panty. Keep checking the panty. And then I'm about back to my next round of easing on this row. And then we have a colorful layer, and I can show you too what I meant about back stitching on the tool. Because even some home machines, I think, are a little rough for putting the tool on. And really, if your tool layer wasn't getting covered, right, our tool layer is getting covered by all kinds of applique work and stuff and sequins and beads. If your tool layer, what was the last thing that was showing, back stitching it on by hand kind of helps you control it and make it look really, really nice. So that's the other advantage by doing that. Okay, so I'm just still easing on at my sides. Oh, I just snapped my thread. Oh no, I snapped my thread. Oh, this is the worst. I'm actually out of bobbin. Check to make sure you have plenty of bobbin. We will revisit this entire layer. So, good thing I didn't load it up with pins. Does anybody have any questions? Right now is a good time for Jared to look for questions while I wind a bobbin. I knew it. It always happens. So I have to put that whole layer on again. But we're this far in, I'm not giving up now. I should have pinched that, so I got a fuller bobbin. No questions? Is anybody there? It's because a lot of these folks are really, really good, and they know exactly what I'm going to say next. They just flatter me by hanging out with me. Boom, boom. I know a lot of people are intimidated by getting an industrial machine. They're not scary, and often what folks will pay for their fancy bells and whistle domestic machine, they can buy an industrial machine, an industrial serger, and still buy a fun domestic machine for the same price. Like this whole Singer I'm at was under $800 for the table, the quiet motor, and the machine. And they have to be serviced a lot less often than a lot of domestic machines. Okay, let's find out really how tragic this was. How far back did I really? Oh, a long way. Almost at the beginning. Yeah, I've got 3 inches on. Well, I'll take it. I should have really checked what was going on while I was sewing. I was just so concentrated on getting it on there well. Okay, back stitch gets started. Overlap the stitches. Certainly this has happened to no one else but me. Okay. Back to easing. Scrunching. So you're just kind of like thinking about it. It's like you've pinned it and divided it in half and divided it in half. I just bent my needle. You guys, I'm cursed all of a sudden. That's live class for you. Oh, I only bent it a little bit. Good thing I have hundreds of them. Long groove in the front. Back stitch again. This is going to be my Frankenstein layer. Okay, here we go. Back to easing and smushing. So the other thing is, it's like I'd rather squish netting onto the panty than yank the panty bigger than it really is. That's like another way to kind of think about this. Okay, we're back to the center. Oh, that made me hot, that set back there. Okay, back to scrunching. But it's nearly a tutu. It's getting there. It's getting there. Hang in there, everybody, with me. It's gonna happen. So I just kind of keep checking, like, how close am I to the center back before I get to my flat spot in the back, and how much do I need to keep easing on here. And we're close. I'm almost to my flat bit. And now I'm at the flat part. Then we'll put some color on. Get the crepe paper out from the ruffler. If you've got money to spend, look up Dowling Pleating Company. They make the same kind of ruffling machine in London, and they use them to make the ruffled ribbons for prize-winning show horses. And instead of changing the dial, like ours, you have to put in these different cams actually. Theirs, you can pick different ruffles just by turning the wheel. Okay, then you go inside and make sure you don't have anything folded over weird, which I don't. Then we're gonna put our next layer on, which has color. So we wanna get these pins out. Okay, the last thing you want is to leave a pin in there. So now I've got 9 and 10, which are gonna go down. So 9, we're gonna find the middle. He's not doubled, he's on his own. Thank you, Deborah. We'll see you tomorrow. So you're good in the morning, right? You know what you're doing? Thank you. It's funny on what the purples look different on each computer screen. Okay, so now purple's gonna go down, and then my tulle purple is also gonna go down. I'm gonna find the middle. I'm gonna keep my same thing where I'm like squishing a little bit extra at the side. But this one will be a little easier because it's not doubled up. Ooh, a little spot of it ran out of the ruffler, but no one will know. Yeah, the Dowling pleater is really cool. I'd have one shipped here, but the shipping is just ridiculous. Bye, have a good night.
Bye.
Maybe Rick will get Wes one and pack it in a suitcase. So I'm gonna fold over the itziest little bit at the beginning. And then, because like, right, we're getting up and getting prettier, I am gonna divide this in half one more time rather than completely eyeballing it. And you'll start to see that over your sides, like where the panty is the narrowest, you've got a bit to scrunch in there. You almost end up with seam allowances riding on top of each other, which is absolutely okay. Ooh, and I've got one micro chunk of net stuck on a stitch, so I'm gonna just clip the net. Nobody's gonna see it. It's not brain surgery. So a little bit flat back there. Then I think I'll show you how I back stitch the tulle on, but we'll just put part of, actually, you know what? We'll get the crotch and stuff sewn up, and then we'll start back stitching this tulle on. Okay. And then tomorrow, we'll probably do an hour and a half again. And if we don't get through everything I wanted to show you, we'll just add another one on Wednesday at the same time. But don't worry, if you can't be there, you still get the recordings and the info. We've covered some good stuff, so that's good. Okay, so my little bit that's going on flat, I've got a full bobbin, yippee. Now, and since this one was ruffled by himself, I actually have a little bit less to ease on because it ruffles a little bit tighter on its own. So I've just got a little bit that I'm squishing in. But still more at the side, which is what we want. And now where I'm at the narrow part of the panty, it's really running right into my white that's right below it. So I've really got to make sure to keep that out of the way. And I've got my little bit to scrunch in. Keep checking that everything is running the right way. And we're at the front. Every time that's the best feeling. You're like, oh, I'm halfway done with this one. When I have done all layers, not doubled, lots of times I put on a layer and then I kind of trim away some of their seam allowance with a little teeny pair of scissors so that I've got less stuff to fight with in the panty. That's another option if you still want to put them on all single. Now I'm just really making sure that I'm not getting the layer below it caught in the purple. Okay, we're almost to the back. And my cord is stuck on there. Then the next thing we're going to do is sew up the center back, which is a wrestling match, and you may choose to do it by hand with sturdy thread and a back stitch. But I will jam it through the sewing machine. So scrunching, scrunching. Now, if your whole top was based on a gorgeous pleat that you've done in netting, you're not going to scrunch anything on. So like if this was the topmost layer and you've made those rolled pleats with the chopsticks or any version of a double or triple or a box pleats or knife pleats, you want to just lay that on flat so that your pretty pleats can shine. You don't want to scrunch them in. So that would be the time where I would say just lay it on flat and don't jam extra at the sides. Okay, so we've got more. Our tulle layer is going to go on top of this, but I'm going to show you how I put that on by hand because I think it works a little more successful. And see, this layer even kind of has a little bit like where I've scrunched it, it's a little bit meandery. By putting the last one or the last two on by hand, you can really keep it looking sharp. Okay, so hey, that's not bad for less than an hour of sewing that stuff all on. That's a lot. So now the next thing I'm gonna do, I've got my center backs in my hand. I'm gonna flip them around so that I can bring my center backs together. So I've got that inch seam allowance at my center back, and I want that on the outside, and I don't want to get any net caught weird in the seam allowance. So I'm going to just kind of start working my way down so that I can pull the center backs together. And you also want it to appear, right, as if the netting all just meets up right at the center back. So the first thing I'm going to pin is my row 1 or my 1, 2. I'm going to get them pinned really good so that when it's all opened up, it looks like they line up. And I'm going to do the same thing with 3 and 4. And on this stuff where it's like really a wrestling match, hand sew it if you don't want to machine sew it. Just make sure it's super, super sturdy. Tie a knot every couple inches. Because I say if the machine sewing is going to look so erratic and crazy because it's a wrestling project, hand sewing will probably look better. Okay, so now I'm going to get all the way down to the crotch. And this we've got our inch seam allowance here. So also on your panty, if you were like, oh, I just wish I had a ½ an inch more room, just change your seam allowance to be a ¼ inch less on each side and sew it up, and that'll give you a little bit more room going around. Okay, so I've pinned this with the line. I've run my pins the direction that the seam is going. And I want to catch, remember we added that piece into the back of the panty? I want to catch about a ½ an inch of that. So that's where I'm going to start my sewing, is about 5½ inches down from the top. And before I sew it, I just kind of take my hands and really make sure that nothing is going to get caught weird in that seam. Then I'm going to just flip it over like a sumo wrestler going out of the rink here, and smash it down what I can smash down with my elbow. So now I'm going to make my zigzag actually a little bit less wide than it was for my net. And I'm going to make my stitch length a hair smaller. So I'm trying to keep this all lined up. This will be hard to see, but so I want to keep it all lined up. And by pinning with the direction of the seam, it's a little easier because you can sew up right up to the pin. And I do a great big old reverse at the beginning. And then like the underside of your seam is what's going to want to slink away from the presser foot. So you want to kind of keep checking. Oh, we lost a pin. That the underside of this isn't like recessing too much. Oh, I lost another pin there, just flinging out of there. And the other thing I like to do on my like first row of net, I like to put a little extra back stitch right there, just so that if something pops apart, it's not gonna all pop apart. Ugh, that's a lot of work. Okay, here's where you cross your fingers. And this is like our first look at the back, which we're gonna put some tacks to hold it all together closer. But it's all right. I've got one pucker. I'm gonna clip out this pucker and re-sew that one itty bitty little spot. I've got a pucker in my mesh. So I'm gonna fix the pucker in my mesh. I'm gonna just go right over the spot where the pucker. So I clipped out the pucker, and I'm sewing like an inch on either side past where I snipped my fiber or my threads. You can have a total seam allowance trim party later. Okay, so pucker's gone, and when we get to some hand tacking, the center back is going to look really good. The next thing, and you'll remember we put our elastics on a safety pin so that we can just, my face looks so red. It's like 10 times redder on the camera than it is in the real world. I don't get it. So we put those safety pins on the elastic earlier. So you want to make sure your elastic's not twisted, but we have to pull this such a short distance in comparison to starting fresh with putting the elastic in. So I'm just kind of evening out my elastic in there. And I already know for this girl that my elastic is pretty much spot on the right length. So if you thought you were going to need to adjust it, you could leave it so that you can get to it and adjust it. So now I've got a twist in my other side. I want to untwist the elastic and then pull that safety pin all the way through. This is something Mona figured out at Ballet Omaha. It was always such a nightmare to like try to put the elastics in these things after you'd sewn all the netting on. And she said, hey, put the elastic in first and just leave the safety pin. It's like so brilliant. Okay, so now I've just pinned my elastic so they don't come apart. So in my center back, I've pinned my elastic. Now we've got this inch seam allowance down the center back with a hook and bar hanging out on it. So you're going to look at the top side, the bar side. On the bar side, the seam allowance, scoot in here. On the bar side, my seam allowance is becoming my underlap. So there's my skirt bar. That's going to become my underlap. On the hook side, the seam allowance is going to get folded back, and we're going to cross stitch along there to make the overlap. So we're making an underlap and overlap. So when you fold this back, when I fold my hook side back, that's the direction I like to fold the seam in the crotch. So instead of putting the seam open in the crotch, I fold it the direction that the hook and bar opening and closing is going to be, so that I always have an underlap and an overlap. So the first thing I do right? We got the elastics there. Then I pinned this seam. So I folded both of my seams to the right because that's the direction this is going to hook closed in. Then I now need to bring my back crotch and my front crotch together. So I'm going to grab them and I'm going to push them all the way through, up through my hip. And I'm going to first pin the center of them. And then I'm going to pin where the seam allowance meets up. Like I don't really need to pin the two edges together other than the spot where the seam allowance is. And that'll make sense here in a moment. So I've got like about a 3/4 inch seam allowance down there. And I find with the stretch mesh panties, I didn't do much trimming of threads the other day. You get a better fit up and down and around. Like if you've got a girl whose girth is a little bit longer, usually there's enough stretch in the panty that this is going to work on that girl and the original girl, or vice versa. If she's a little bit shorter, it's usually going to work too. So the back butt on this panty, the crotch is a little bit bigger so that there's a little more room for the back of her butt. So you just kind of stretch the back crotch to meet the front crotch. And then we're going to zigzag that right across the elastic. So now if I wanted to pull my elastic through the casing, I would skip the casing and sew the crotch together. Then you can tighten your elastic later and then go back and put a couple hand stitches to finish off the casing. So now, okay, now I'm going to jam all this through there again. And then I'm going to show you a few hand sewy things that are going to happen here. So I really want to make sure that her crotch doesn't pop out ever, right? So I'm starting with reverse. I'm going to go just like a couple stitches in and reverse, except my sewing machine is giving me trouble. Is my bobbin winder on? What's going on here? My bobbin winder was stuck on. So I go in a few inches and zigzag. Then I'm going to keep it all as lined up as best I can. I like to get to the center of that spot, like the center of the first half, and do a back stitch or two, just to make sure that that stays together forever. Or if it does come undone, that the whole thing isn't going to come undone. So when I get to the halfway on the other side, same thing, I'm going to do a little extra back stitch, get all the way to my edge, and then do a really good back stitch again. So if you didn't want to stitch over the elastics, you can just clip a hole right in the panty mesh because it doesn't unravel. You can clip a hole just before your seam allowance and pull your elastics out. So now let's do some hand sewing in here. I'm going to grab some stuff off the table and come right back to this very spot. So we're going to pull the pins out of the whole crotch and then do a little hand sewing on here, which I don't know if we did do the last time. I've got my good needle that's bent just enough. And I wonder if I should do this in black thread because it'll show. I'm going to do this in black and we'll change it to white later. So I've got some black silamide. If you don't have silamide, get silamide from Wah Wax Sewing and don't pull it from the little window in the middle. Cut the bottom and pull it from the bottom. It's waxed hand sewing thread that ends up the perfect length for hand sewing. And it's really, really, really sturdy. Okay, so tie your knot. Now, let's look in the crotch and let me show you the sewing that's going to go on in the crotch. Okay, so we've got this crotch seam allowance, right? We have a front crotch and a back crotch seam allowance. So I don't like them to be open. I like them to both go towards the back. So I'm pushing my front crotch towards the back crotch, and then I'm going to cross stitch all of that up towards the back. So if you want to zoom in on this here in a second, right? So I'm taking all of my seam allowance here. I've got my front and back seam allowance. I'm going to push them towards the back, and then you'll see with our panty pattern, when you push the front towards the back, the edges of it line up, right? If I push the front towards the front, this edge here doesn't match anything, but if I push it towards the back, all of a sudden it matches up to the panty. That's on purpose. So, and where the elastics are, I like to just, like this is, we're not going for pretty, we're going for sturdy. Where the elastics are, I like to first make just a couple loops to make sure that the elastic is not going to come undone. And then I'm going to cross stitch both, so I'm catching through both of those seam allowances. And I'm going to cross stitch that. It doesn't have to be super tight, but you don't want it laying lumpy in her crotch, so we're going to push them both to the back and cross stitch it. And when I flip it over, you'll see that I'm going through both layers of the panty fabric instead of just one. I want this to stay hammered down forever. If you think it's never going to need to be adjusted, you can trim out some of this seam allowance. If you're like, this is a one-timer and you want it super duper flat. And then a lot of people are like, yeah, but she's got a couple seams in her crotch. She's also being thrown through the air and dancing on her toes. Oops, I didn't get that one lined up very well. So I guarantee that this little bit in the crotch is not her main concern. If it is, she's just perfected everything else so well and has nothing to worry about. So you continue on with that, and that really holds that up nice. Then you'll see here on the outside that I am pricking through all the layers of the mesh on the top side of my cross stitch. So we'll really, in the real world, we're going to do that in white. Now let me show you the other thing that we are going to do with the silamide. We need to stitch back the hook side of the hook. So there's my hook, right? There's my hook. I want it to stay this direction forever. So I'm going to fold back the inch just where the hook is, and I'm going to cross stitch along that edge until I'm about 1 inch or 2 inches below the hook. So I'm going to cross stitch this back. And the cross stitch is nice because it's flexible. So if we just did a running stitch with sturdy thread, we might snap the thread. So you're just going to cross stitch to, actually you could cross stitch to where your seam opens up, where your center back seam opens up. And then really when I get to the hooks and bars, or not the bar, the hook, when I get to just the hook, I like to put a few stitches that actually go through all the layers of my panty right through the base of the hook to keep the hook from sliding out ever. So you're going to cross stitch the edge with the hook back and then stitch around the hook. And that makes it really nice and flat for when you hook that hook and bar up. So we're starting to have a tutu. Let me shove a towel in here and show you what I mean when I say cross stitch or back stitch on the tulle. And then tomorrow we'll start with tacking, and we might add another hour, an hour and a half on Wednesday, just because this is so much fun. And we're not going to mail this till Wednesday night. So let me grab some more. Actually, would you grab me gray silamide? What you grabbing? Is there some? Oh, yeah, and a towel. I'm trapped because I have the microphone. I did wash my blue sweatshirt that I love so much. I'm going to use gray since we're going to be sewing on some purple. And then the other thing I like to do is, even though I think I've sewn this stuff on all right and that I didn't stretch it out too much, since this is going to get steamed and tacked and the bodice is going to sew on later. So, right, this one doesn't have a basque on it. This tutu doesn't have a basque on it because the bodice is going to get piped on the bottom and join right to the tutu. Just that group, just pink one's good. That'll be enough. I like to pin a ribbon around the top so that it doesn't grow. So I'm just taking some tailor's tape, which is like cheapy grow grain ribbon Prussian stuff. And I am going to measure out. Her high hip is 30 inches. So I've measured like 31 inches of ribbon. And you can do this all with safety pins or straight pins. It doesn't matter. I'm going to do it with straight pins since that's what I've got right in front of me. I am going to take this ribbon and tack it. Actually, you know what? I could do my tool first. Before you get to steaming and tacking, you want to take something and pin it around the top or where your topmost stuff is going to be so that you're not stretching it out bigger. So like right now, this ribbon just fits my panty, which is good. I haven't stretched it bigger than we want it to be. But actually, I'm going to put my tool on, and then before we start steaming and tacking it tomorrow, I'm going to put this ribbon back on. So see that ribbon in there is not letting the panty grow when I get to steaming and tacking. But actually, I'm going to put my tool on, and then we're going to put this ribbon back on. But I do want to pin the center back closed. We're not going to sew the tool over the center back. We just want to know where it is. So when you put the ribbon around the waist, it kind of acts like hug snug or something, which is to keep seams from going. I've got my tool, but then before I start putting the tool in, I want to start letting this panty know that there's going to be a button here. So if you've got a leg form or like a panty form that's just a crotch with leg stumps in it, that's really great. Or you can just put a towel in because we want this to start taking shape, and having that towel in there is going to help start simulating that there's a butt in here. I'm so popular. Oh, Deborah says, unplug the microwave. I'll say, no problem. She saw my note. No problem. I had to message her. I don't want her ride home to be ruined. Okay, so now we're going to find the center of my tool. And I've got my center mark still here on my panty. So I'm going to find the center, and we're just going to start on half of this sucker. Then I'm going to find my other center, my center back, and get that pinned on. And then I do want to make sure that the center back stays closed. So when I'm sewing right there, I'll unpin it, but generally I want this to stay closed so stuff doesn't get crooked. Then I'm going to find my side, just like we did earlier. And I'm going to squish again, just a smidge, even though this tool is pretty darn full, I'm going to squish just a little bit extra at the side. And this is on my topmost row on the panty. I'm just kind of like straddling the center of that row. I'm going to make some of the front flat. So there I've got a little to ease on at the side. And I'm going to make some of the back flat. And let me thread my needle in gray here and show you what I mean by back stitch. But did I probably just lost my needle. I've got a huge one here. Is this too huge? This is too huge. I'm going to grab a needle. I've got one right behind me. So this stitch that I'm using to put this on, we're going to always be sewing from left to right, but our needle is going to always go right to left. So we're going to sew this direction. Actually, you could back stitch from either direction. I'll show you. But the back stitch is just basically means we've got a thread like surpassing the thread on the underside or the top side, and it's flexible, And also it gives you more length. So if this started to come undone, you'll have enough thread somewhere to tie it off. And it's also how we put the bodices on. So if the bodice has piping on the bottom, we use a back stitch and then we tie a knot every now and then. So I'm going to undo my center back for just a minute. And I'm kind of centering, I've got 2 lines of gathering. I'm kind of centering them over my top edge. I'm going to start with my knot in the back. And then my needle is always going to go from right to left, but I'm going to travel to the right. So it uses up a lot of thread, but it's flexible and it keeps it nice and flat. And this is what we'll use to put the bottom of the bodice on. And what's great is if it snaps, it's more likely to kind of knot itself off. But you can do the same thing every now and then and just tie a knot. And I find, especially with the tool, that back stitching it on by hand, I can control it a little bit better than I can with the sewing machine. And sometimes if you're working with tulle, the sewing machine is a little bit rougher and you'll rip it. So let me try to get my left hand more out of the way. So I'm at my easing spot. My needle is going from the right to the left. And my threads are always kind of passing each other. So I'm eating up a lot of thread here. And I bet in some book I've got a visual of this that I can send everybody a PDF of. So we're going to continue around back stitching the tulle on. And then you can see it's still got a little bit of flex. So if we have to ease this onto the bodice or shrink it, if we have to stretch it onto the bodice or squish it onto the bodice, the back stitch is going to help a lot with that. And just for fun, let's set the beginning of our top plate up here again. Ooh, it's going to look so pretty. And then once we clip out some little bits of this and put a little more purple paint, it's all going to start to come together, the color. And then we'll put a few little spots floating around the outside. Let me actually grab the top plate that Deborah was working on for the fairy doll. Okay, do you want to grab it? I don't know where it's at. And we'll look at that. And then that's where we're going to leave for today. So when we start to tack this, the first thing we're going to do is give the top a little bit of steam. We're going to give the bottom a little bit of steam. Then we're going to tie it all up like an onion so that we can start to put our hoop in the hoop casing. So this is our layer that's got the hoop casing. That's what we'll start with. So I'll tack a good chunk of this tomorrow. We'll check in on more decoration, and then I'll probably add an hour and a half again on Wednesday, just so we can cover everything we did. Just throw her right up there. I don't know where she's at, but let's look.
She's adding the center of them.
Oh, good. This is fun. Oh, this is so much fun. Okay, so we're back to our fairy doll top plate. Deborah has got all of her fruffles on, all of her little, and I'll show you tomorrow, the next day, how we make these little ruffles. For most everybody, it's a repeat. But what she's doing now is we've got this lace that's got little white flowers on it, and then little pink squiggle leaves. So she's just going like flower leaf, and she's fitting them into the windows left in the petals. And then she's going to outline them with pink gimp upholstery trim. So all the way around the fairy doll, she's going to have these little teardrops of lace. And then we'll be putting those pink feathers and stuff back in there. Let me hold a little bit of fairy doll on here. Where's she at? Yeah, so this is going to be super duper cute when it's all more hooked together. The next thing we'll be doing on the bodice is the center front. And then by tomorrow, we'll have both of our sleeves in, and we'll get our crisscross figured out on the center front and show you that. and this is going over a pink tutu that we've already made in the same style we made the white one. Any questions, or we will say goodbye and see you tomorrow. It's already pitch black outside. Well, almost pitch black. Sun's almost gone. Okay, it's been fun. I hope you've got some new info and are inspired. And tomorrow we'll just keep putting some stuff together, and we'll have some more stuff put together before we start. Tonight, I'm taking home this bodice and starting to pin some of my appliques on. And you'll see that up here, like we've got all the fabric and stuff in the armpit. It doesn't need to come out till later because I have the stitching line basted and I can see what's going on. But I'm super excited about all of this stuff. It's turning out really cute. Thanks.